morning again. We are going to continue our study in Exodus today. And up till this point in time, as we've been studying God's self-revelation to the Israelites and to Moses himself, we've seen God reveal himself as sovereign, as the transcendent helper, the promise keeper, redeemer. Last week we looked at it, God revealing himself as leader. And this week we're going to look at God revealing himself as provider. I am provider. Now, Israel had, probably huge expectations of God when they began to journey to the promised land through the wilderness. And they were, in essence, demanding that he lead them according to their expectations. And their tone kind of reflected their attitude, continually complaining and having really short memories. And today we're going to look at the need to humble ourselves before God. The Israelites needed to learn how to be humble before God and to trust him. And we need to see that sometimes in our own lives. We need to change our own expectations. And, probably the Israelites, when they left Egypt, thought that everything was going to be rosy. Life was never going to be hard again after God freed them from Egypt. They praised God for how he gloriously delivered them from the Egyptian army by taking them across the Red Sea on dry land. But their praise and adoration of God at that point in time were not an indication that Israel was fully devoted to God. And as a result, God had some tests for Israel that would reveal the truth and the true nature of their hearts. Exodus chapter 15 is where we're going to begin this morning. And if you have one of the maps that we started out this study with, you'll be able to see their first stop as they journeyed into the wilderness was at Marah. And God gave them their first test at Marah. Chapter 15, verse 22 through 24. Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through 24. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So God brings them to this test, their first test at Marah. And Israel complained. They began to murmur. They are just 3 days into the wilderness, heading south, kind of along the Gulf. Well, today it's called the Gulf of Suez. But just for 3 days, they're following kind of the shoreline, probably inland a little bit. And they didn't find any drinking water along the way. We see that in verse 22. And eventually they come to Marah. And that's probably, if you want to look on a modern day map, at Ain Hawara. And even today at Ain Hawara, the water is salty and bitter. Now, going without water for 3 days and then finding water and discovering it was undrinkable is probably hard to handle both physically and emotionally. And the Israelites, asked Moses, what are we going to drink? Which is a legitimate question. but they were murmuring as they asked the question. They were whining and complaining. And you might ask, why is that a sin? Well, whining or complaining is the same thing as telling God that he's not doing his job right. He doesn't know what he's doing. And that the complainer or the whiner could handle the situation better than he could. Now, the Israelites' complaint might be legitimate or understandable from a human perspective, but from God's perspective, there's no such thing as an understandable, excusable sin. And, hardships often cause people to complain against God. And it's perhaps because they think that hardships signify that God doesn't care about them or that he has something against them. You hear that a lot when people go through trouble. Well, I must have done something that God has it out for me. They consider the hardships as God's personal attacks on them, which is far from the truth. When God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, his goal wasn't to make their lives as comfortable as possible. Instead, he wanted them to have a heart for him. So he led them to places of need on purpose. And those needs exposed the true nature of their hearts. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. And we'll see what God wanted the Israelites to learn by experiencing need. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 and 3. It says, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to provide thee, and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live." So what did he want them to learn? Well, he wanted them to learn that they needed to humble themselves before him and to trust his guidance, believing that he would provide for their needs in his timing, not theirs. God brought the Israelites to a point of helplessness to help them understand that he was directing them with a purpose. And it's ironic that Israel would have worried about having no drinking water just days after God had used millions of gallons of water to utterly destroy Egypt's army. God had demonstrated absolutely his power over nature at that point in time. And they had even sung about it. We talked about it at the end of our lesson last week about the song that they sang. Not only that, they had witnessed God turning the water to blood in Egypt. Again, further showing that he had control over all nature. And he could easily have made that water drinkable at Marah. And then we see God does provide a solution. Verse 25, the last part of verse 25 of chapter 15. Well, let me read the whole verse. "And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree." This is Moses cried unto the Lord. "Which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and ordinance, and there he proved them." So Moses heard the people's murmuring, and he went to God for help. And God showed Moses a tree that if he would throw it into the well, it would make it drinkable. Now, there are some who would like to speculate what kind of tree it was, or whether it had some qualities that would have naturally made the water pleasant. But the tree was really a prop. It could have been anything. It could have been nothing. God could have easily turned the water sweet with nothing. It was no different than Moses' rod, a prop. That rod had no power. God had the power to turn that rod into a serpent and back again. The tree had no power. God had the power to use it or to make it look like it was the tree that turned the water potable. And you notice also here that God was patient with Israel. He didn't jump on them for their lack of faith. He didn't go to tirade about how much he had done for them to get them tomorrow. And if you think about it, he's done a lot of amazing things to get them to this point out of Egypt. He was very gracious instead, and he provided for their needs despite their murmuring. But we see there in that verse, God gave an ordinance. Let me read for you verses 25 again and 26 of chapter 15. And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast in the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them, and said, If thou wilt diligently hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. This ordinance had both an immediate significance and a future significance. Well, let's look at the immediate significance first. So after graciously providing water for his people, it says God made a statute and an ordinance for Israel. Basically a rule or an agreement. This was a conditional promise, basically. And this conditional promise was based on them believing and obeying his voice. Well, what would Israel need to believe about God in order to obey his voice? Well, it's that he is the one true God who stays true to his word. In order for them to believe in God, to obey his voice, they needed to believe that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. And you might ask, well, what reason did the Israelites have for even believing that God was the one true God that stayed true to his words? Well, they were carrying with them the evidence of that. Joseph's bones. God promised that, he would bring the people back to that promised land. And Joseph knew it. And Joseph made his descendants promise that when they left, they would take his bones with him. And they did. Moses collected up his bones and took them with him. And it was a witness to the fact that God fulfills his promises. He's true to his word. God's ordinance was a conditional promise to Israel. If they were diligent to heed God's voice and obey his commandments and keep all his statutes, it says then God wouldn't put any of the diseases on them that he'd put on the Egyptians. And the mention of diseases here is not a general reference to illness of any kind. God didn't promise Israel here that if they obeyed and believed and that he would give them perfect health. The word diseases probably included the plagues God had brought on the Egyptians, especially the boils, as well as any other diseases that God intentionally used to chasten his people. The conditional promise is that God would refrain from chastening them with devastating widespread diseases if they would obey his voice and follow his commandments. They'd still get sick, but those illnesses would not have been part of God's chastening. Again, go to Deuteronomy chapter 28 this time. And we'll see some of the indicators that God was chastening or what some of those indicators were, that God was chastening his people with diseases. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 58. I'm going to read verse 58 through 61. It says in verse 58, If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God. Then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and sore sicknesses, and of long continuances. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also every sickness, every plague, which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. So what are some of the indications that it is a disease of chastening? Well, the diseases would be widespread, long-lasting, and devastating to the people. But did you notice there, going back to Exodus chapter 15, in verse 27 there, or verse 26 there, the end of it, it says, "For I am the Lord that healeth thee." God identified himself as the Lord that healeth thee, in the sense that if Israel responded to his chastening in the time of these diseases of chastening, he would remove the diseases that he had brought on them as a result of their disobedience. So it was, it was conditional. If they believed, they wouldn't have the diseases. If they stopped believing and obeying, these diseases of chastening would come upon them. But if they turned their hearts and went back, then God would remove those diseases. So that was the immediate significance. What is a future significance of this ordinance? Well, if you remember back, God brought the plagues on Egypt so Pharaoh would let God's people go. But he also, we saw another reason he brought the plagues to Egypt was to address Egypt's refusal to acknowledge that all their blessings had come from him, from God, rather than their false gods. God clearly said that he wanted Egypt to know him as Jehovah. We saw that in Exodus chapter 7, verse 5 and 17, and Exodus 8, verse 22. Consequently, all the plagues of Egypt had directly affected either Egypt's abundance or their well-being, and all of them challenged Egypt's God or gods. But even then, most of the Egyptians still refused to recognize Jehovah as the one who had blessed their land so richly. You remember, they started receiving blessing from the time of Joseph, when he was put in charge and saved them from famine. Their land had been blessed because of the people being there, or God blessed their land, and they refused to acknowledge God as Jehovah, as Lord. Now, I said this is a future significance for Israel. God wanted Israel to remember that they needed to rely on him for needs, and having them witness the plagues and travel through the wilderness would show them that he is reliable and trustworthy. But once they settled in the promised land, they would be like Egypt. They would have an abundance of food and water, and they would, like the Egyptians, would have fertile cropland, many natural resources. And their temptation, once they got there, would not to complain about lack of food or water. Their temptation would be to serve other gods and credit other gods for all the abundance that they had, that God had really provided for them. God warned Israel not to let that happen. Again, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you'll go there with me. Deuteronomy chapter 28. Should have told you to stay there. Sorry. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 45. Verse 45 through 47. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded thee. And they shall be upon thee for a sign and a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. Because thou servest not the Lord thy God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things. God expected Israel, once they were in the promised land, to obey his commands and serve him with joy and gladness for the abundance of everything he had given to them. That was the future part of this ordinance, that once they got to the promised land, they needed to continue to obey him and rely on him and serve him and give him credit for the abundance that they had. Now, God went on to warn Israel here in Deuteronomy in verses 49 through 57 that if they did fail to obey him, another nation would invade them, eat their crops, consume their abundance. Israel would be left without any food at all. In fact, they would become so desperate while under siege that they would eat their own children. Once in captivity, they would be hungry, thirsty, and lacking their basic needs. Israel didn't heed these warnings once they were in the promised land. Both Israel and Judah were eventually taken into captivity by Assyria and Babylon. And even after Babylon took Judah captive, the Jews left in the land as a remnant they still refused to trust God. Some of them wanted to flee to Egypt for safety. They feared Babylon would return to take them captive too. The prophet Jeremiah warned them that they would suffer famine and pestilence if they fled to Egypt. But the remnant rebelled against God despite the warning and claimed they would be safe if they burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, a false god. And it's probably relating to Queen of Heaven reference, is probably a reference to the goddess Ashtaroth. She was the goddess of fertility. In the New Testament, Artemis, also called Diana, is the Greek goddess associated with Ashtaroth. So they thought, well, it is the reason we are under this curse, so to speak, or this punishment is because we served God. We need to serve Ashtaroth, and this will all be taken away from us. They, like I said, they wrongly blame their service to God for the Babylonian captivity. So what did God do when these remnant went to Egypt? God sent Babylon to overrun Egypt and bring all the calamities on the Jewish remnant that Jeremiah had prophesied would come on them in Egypt. Whether Israel worshiped God in the promised land would partly depend on whether they humbled themselves to trust God to provide their needs. So in that sense, it makes sense that God began their journey through the wilderness at Marah, where he exposed their lack of trust in him and their thirst for control over their own lives. He wanted them to turn to him and worship him as their provider of needs, even in the midst of their needs. But Israel wanted a God whom they could control, to whom they could dictate what they wanted, and he would provide it. They wanted to serve a God that would never lead them to a place of need. So that was the first test. But after Marah, God leads them to Elim, verse 27 of chapter 15 of Exodus. And they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters. So after the test at Marah, where there was bitter water that God turned drinkable, he brings them to Elim, a place of an abundance of water and shade. And you would expect Israel to be overjoyed and thankful to God for his provision here at Elim. But there's no record saying that Israel was thankful for the provision of water here at Elim. That would have been the right response, thanking God for what he had provided. If they had rejoiced in the Lord, no doubt Moses would have recorded it and included it here in his record, especially sandwiched between glaring examples of lacking trust in God. And it really exposes the true heart of Israel and the true hearts of those who fail to thank God for providing their needs, that they really probably think they're entitled to have their needs met, or they expect God to always act in what they perceive as their best interest. So after Elim comes the second test, a test in the desert of sin in Exodus chapter 16. So after his provision of water at Marah and Elim, you might expect Israel to respond to God with trust the next time they had a need. But again, Israel complains. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. And they took their journey from Elim and all the congregation of the children of Israel and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt, the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For you have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. 45 days. This is the 15th day of the second month since they left Egypt. 45 days. Now, think about what they've seen in those 45 days. God parted the Red Sea and destroyed the Egyptian army in it after they'd passed through on dry land. God provided water at Marah by turning the waters drinkable. He had led them to Elim, where there was plenty of water to drink. So they come to the desert, running low on water and food, and they start to complain again. The entire congregation complained to Moses and Aaron, saying it would have been better if the Lord killed them in Egypt, where they at least had meat and bread to eat. Basically, they're saying it would have been better to die when we were not thirsty and not hungry than to be free and a little bit hungry and alive. You know, I'd rather be full and dead than alive and hungry and thirsty. And that's kind of silly if you think about it. You know, what good does being full if you're dead? They obviously had very selective memory. They remembered only how their bellies were full in Egypt. They forgot how they were worked to the point of exhaustion. They forgot how the unrealistic demands of the Egyptians had put on them, or how the Egyptians had killed their firstborn boys. They even forgot they were slaves. And more unbelievably, they were ungrateful for all the miracles God had wrought to free them from that slavery. Israel's heart still has not changed. And we see then God providing a solution again. Chapter 16, verses 4 through 8. Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. And Moses and Aaron said unto the children of Israel, At even ye shall know that the Lord hath brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning ye shall see the glory of the Lord, for he heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that ye murmur against us? And Moses said, This shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, for that the Lord heareth your murmurings which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. So God patiently provides for the Israelites again. He rained down bread, which they called manna because they didn't know what it was, for them to gather and eat in the mornings. And in the evening, he brought quail for them to catch and eat for meat. And Moses and Aaron are careful to point out here that their complaining and murmuring is not against Moses and Aaron. They are complaining and murmuring against God. And they were right in doing so, pointing that out, because the Israelites should have recognized just how offensive their complaining was to God, after all he's already done for them. And through his provision of food, God expected his people to know that he is the Lord your God. We can see this in verse 12 of chapter 16. And as such, he should be responded to with humility and worship. But instead, they maintain their desire for God to serve them according to their wishes. That was again the case. They want God to do what they want, not what God knows is best for them. And with this solution, God gave limitations, specific regulations to test the Israelites to see if they would obey him. And we see first off, Israel disobeyed the regulation of the leftovers. The first regulation was simple. God forbade them from leaving any leftover manna in their tents overnight. They were only to gather what they could eat and throw out the rest. If they did gather more than and didn't throw it out, the manna would stink and be filled with worms. And even with that limitation, some of the Israelites stubbornly did what they wanted to do and gathered more than they needed and kept it in their tents. And when they did that, they awoke to the rank smell of rotting manna. Let's read in chapter 16, verse 19 through 21. And Moses said, "Let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was wroth with them. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, when the sun waxed hot, and it melted." So Israel disobeyed the regulation concerning leftovers. Now, you might ask, why would God want them to throw out the leftovers every evening? What was he trying to teach them? Well, he was trying to teach them that he would provide for their daily needs if they would live according to his commands. You know, I'm going to provide for you daily. Don't be looking forward. Just look today. And if you live according to my commands, you're not going to suffer any of the consequences. But they still blatantly disobeyed. Some blatantly disobeyed. And it showed that Israel was in a power struggle with God for control of their circumstances. They wanted God to bend to their desires. So they tested him by collecting more manna than he had commanded them to collect. The second regulation on this was concerning the Sabbath, and Israel disobeyed the regulation concerning the Sabbath. Chapter 16, verse 27. 27 through 30. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, "How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you on the sixth day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. Now, God's second regulation concerning this manna seemed to violate the first one. He told them on the sixth day, you gather twice as much so that you have something to eat on the seventh day, because there's going to be no manna on the Sabbath. Not surprisingly, some of the people got up on the seventh day to go out and collect the manna, and there was none. They went hungry on that day. There was no manna. And again, they wanted God to serve them and conform to their desires. And by doing that, they didn't realize that by disobeying the second time, they were essentially doing the opposite of what they'd done for the first time. And it was a true testimony of their power-hungry hearts. Basically, I want to run my life. I want God to do what I want him to do for me. The people rebelled against God purposefully by disobeying his regulations. How hard is it to do to just follow after what God told them to do? You only collect what you need to eat and throw out the rest every day. On the sixth day, you collect twice as much because there's nothing going to be on the seventh day. That is not that hard of a regulation. It is not that hard to follow after. But because of their hearts, their hardened hearts and their power-hungry hearts, they refused to obey what God told them to do. And we see here that God also provided a witness of his provision for them in verses 31 through 36. And that witness was based on, providing manna. And providing manna for the people was kind of a watershed moment for Israel and their relationship with God. It proved that God was going to take care of their daily needs. God had instructed Moses to collect some of the manna and keep it as a testimony of his faithfulness. Future generations would still be able to observe the manna and know that God is the provider of needs. So that manna that God commanded Moses to gather, and Moses gathered it, put it aside, that never stank or bred worms. It was there as a witness or a testimony to God's provision, daily provision for the people. And then we come to the third test, the test at Rephidim in Exodus chapter 17. Now, by now you might expect Israel to be ready to be humble and submit to God, wouldn't you think? After all, they're getting bread and meat every day. But God tested them one more time to see what their hearts might reveal. Exodus chapter 17, Israelites set out from the wilderness of Sin and came to Rephidim, and what they found there was no water to drink. And this was different from the first test where there was at least water present, but it was undrinkable. Exodus chapter 17, let me read for you verses 1 through 4. And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is it that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. So they set out from the wilderness of Sin, come to Rephidim, no water there. What evidence is there that the Israelites actually trusted God less at Rephidim than they did in the previous two places? Well, they made demands of Moses and then threatened to stone him to death. Instead of trusting God more, they seem to be trusting God less the longer they go. God is now providing for them food, bread and meat. Up to this point, he has always provided water when they needed it. But here they come to Rephidim, there's no water there, and they're ready to kill Moses. They're still not trusting God. The people's complaints at Rephidim provided the third witness about the condition of their hearts. There's no doubt that they were very proud and demanding rather than humble and grateful. Still a power struggle against God. They wanted him to conform to their desires and follow their timing. And again, God does provide a solution. Chapter 17, verse 5 through 7. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee the elders of Israel, and thy rod, wherewith thou smotest the river, and take in thy hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? Once again, God provides water for Israel. He had Moses take the rod he had used to part the waters of the Red Sea and strike a rock, and God caused water to flow out of the rock so that Israel could quench their thirst. And the last statement of verse 7 there is very telling. They tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? By this question of God's presence, the Israelites again revealed that they expected God to serve them according to their expectations of him. And you got to think about, well, is God with us or not? What is that big cloud in front of us during the day and that pillar of fire at night? They've had plenty of evidence that God is with them. But again, it's their hearts that have a problem. Since they kept facing needs, they wondered if God was actually with them. But every time they faced a need, God provided for them. He was trying to teach them. They expected for God to provide their needs instantly and according to their liking. And they probably have learned this expectation of God from the Egyptians, the way the Egyptians interacted with their gods. The Egyptians conducted themselves in such a way as to try to control or coerce gods or their gods in order to have comfortable, easy lives. But Jehovah cannot be controlled or coerced. He is Lord. The 3 tests in the wilderness revealed Israel's lack of humility before him. They fought God for control and for the right to determine how life would go for them in the wilderness. And if you look on the back of the handout there, you'll see Israel's growing dissatisfaction with God. The longer they went, the more dissatisfied they, instead of seeing how God had provided for them and becoming more trustworthy and serving him. And you might ask, why would God deliver such a rebellious, hard-hearted, doubtful, demanding, power-hungry people from slavery? It goes back to his keeping of his promises. He is faithful to keep his promises, and because he loved humanity and would one day provide for their salvation through a descendant of Israel. And it's kind of fitting that we have this study today on Resurrection Day, which in this week we celebrate the greatest provision that God has made for all mankind in sending his son as that sacrificial lamb. But we see people all over today in this world, not only in the world, but in churches, trying to bend God to what they want, make God who they want God to be. They want salvation on their terms. And it's really easy to follow. Trust God and obey. Let's close there in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for this day and this time that we can spend in your word. Father, maybe we'll be able to take something from this today and search our own hearts and see that maybe we're not responding to you in the way that you would really have us to respond. Work in our hearts, work in our lives, and help us to be the people you've called us to be. It's in your precious name we pray. Amen.